All right, so we saw in the last section that when you map an input to an output, in the particular case we were looking at was in English loanword adaptation in Maori, it's not just the case that you impose the markedness constraints of your language onto the input. It looks like you also impose the constraint that the input and the output should be relatively similar to one another. We don't randomly add extra stuff. We don't change this input more than we need to in order to get it to map to a possible Maori output. So how are we going to model that? Well, in optimality theory, we use a second family of constraints called faithfulness constraints. And these are constraints that penalize certain relationships between input and output. They say, hey, if you do this thing to the input when you're making an output, that's bad. These are different from markedness constraints, which look only at the output and say, hey, do you have any of these things in here? Then that's bad. In many cases, including the loanword situation that we're looking at, this is one of the clearest cases, we'll see that the goal of making an output conform to markedness constraints is going to be directly in tension with the goal of keeping it as similar as possible to the input. Right? So for instance, the output sheep would be as similar as possible to this English input. But if we did that, we'd be optimizing for input-output mappings while totally ignoring the phonotactics of Maori, because that would violate these constraints in Maori. The least marked option, or less marked option, would be this kind of a mapping of hipi, which conforms to phonotactics of Maori, but now we're doing so at the expense of changing the input. So these goals of maintaining similarity to the input, of faithfulness, and maintaining Maori-like output patterns of markedness, these are directly in tension, directly in conflict with one another. How are we going to reconcile these conflicting goals? This is what optimality theory is as a theory of grammar. It's a theory of how the possible ways are to resolve conflicting goals within a phonological grammar. And how are we going to do that? Well, we decided that markedness is going to be encoded as constraints. So if we're going to do that, then we should better also encode similarity as a series of constraints. And the way that we're going to prioritize one kind of goal over another kind of goal is by prioritizing some constraints over other ones. So I'll get to what that means in a moment, but first let's look at the actual constraints themselves. These are fairly simple, especially compared to the markedness constraints, which you often need to infer by looking at detailed featural properties of the sounds in a language. Faithfulness constraints are fairly uniform and they're almost all the same. Here's what they say. Penalize possible outputs that are different from their inputs. That's what every faithfulness constraint says. And so the most common one that we'll be using in this class are constraints that say, don't change this feature between your input and your output. And I'm going to refer to these as ident constraints for the most part in this class. You'll see these formulated as ident constraints in most of the sources we'll look at. Occasionally you'll just see these formulated as faith constraints. They mean exactly the same thing. And so here's how this works. If you have a constraint ident strident, it would say, hey, penalize a possible output if its value for the feature strident is different from the input. And so, for instance, if you were going to map sheep to hipi in Maori, well, the input value for strident in sh is going to be plus. This is a plus strident sound. But the output value in ha is going to be minus strident because this is a non-strident fricative. And so you're going to violate a faithfulness constraint, ident strident. Similarly, for any feature you can imagine, there should be an ident constraint. So this is totally uniform. Any phonological feature that's meaningful in phonology is going to have a constraint that says don't change that feature. Right? So don't change stridency, don't change nasality, don't change voicing, don't change coronal, don't change syllabic, and so on and so forth. Every single feature is going to have a penalty for changing it, and we model that as there just being a constraint for every single feature that's penalized by things that change that feature in comparing the input and the output. Different from markedness constraints, these ones only have to look at the output. They don't care what was in the input. So you can see, in this case, the goal of not having strident fricatives, which is definitely a goal in malady, is in direct conflict with the goal of preserving stridency between the input and the output. So let me actually put this one in here. And I'll sometimes abbreviate these ident strident as ID, or I'll sometimes do it as a fancy cursive F mark that just stands for faithfulness. And what you can see in this particular case is that the malady goal of not having stridence is directly in conflict with the malady goal or the general goal of preserving the input properties in the output. In this particular case, it looks like this goal of not having strident fricatives is prioritized above this one, which says don't change stridency. If you reprioritize these in a different way, you'd get a different kind of grammar. So those are how ident constraints work. There's another set of faithfulness constraints that penalize adding or removing a sound. We're going to put that on hold for now, and we'll come back to it later. Briefly, these constraints have sort of confusing special names in optimality theory for reasons I don't think anybody fully understands. The one against deleting segments is referred to as max, and the one against adding segments, says don't add a segment in the output that wasn't in the input, is referred to as dep. We're not going to use these right this second. We'll come back to them later. What do faithfulness constraints do? They encode the observation that repairing some marked structure always involves a trade-off between producing an acceptable output and staying as close as possible to the underlying form. So again, in malady, we don't just arbitrarily change anything that malady doesn't like into a random sequence of other consonants or vowels. We do this in a way that preserves phonological similarity as much as possible. So we change the value for place of articulation for this fricative and for stridency, but we don't change in order to conform to malady grammar, but we find a segment that's allowable in malady that has the same values for voicing. This is minus voice, right? It's minus sonorant. It's plus continuant. It's a fricative, right? So we don't change those features because we don't need to in order to get an acceptable malady output. Right? And this is what faithfulness constraints do. They encode the observation that all else being equal, grammars seem to have as a goal preserving as many input values of their features as they can in the output within the constraints of having to conform to the grammatical patterns of the particular language. So again, the loanword situation is particularly clear here, and that's why I use this as an example. What the loanword grammar is essentially saying is, hey, take this word, make it acceptable in malady, but keep it close enough to the original English that it has some chance of being understood. Don't make unnecessary changes. That first part, make the word acceptable in malady, is going to involve markedness constraints. The second part, but try to keep it as close as you can to the original English source, that's going to be encoded by faithfulness constraints, one for every single feature. Now, the way in which these sets of constraints can be prioritized differently is going to be pretty specific in optimality theory, and I'll talk about that in the next part.